Look, we're needing to move on, but what a fantastic session that was. The last time I introduced an economist, I had to also talk about breaking into his house at 1:30 in the morning. Thank goodness this is not Cameron Bagri, but Shamubeel Eaqub, who has over 2 decades of experience as an economist in Wellington, Melbourne and Auckland, leading a bunch of international banks and consultancies. He's going to look at how trade volatility, climate pressures and labour skills gaps shape horticulture's future. And there's also going to be a panel discussion after a wee break after this. So stay seated for half an hour, Shamubeel, then we'll have a brief break and into the panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Shamubeel Eaqub.
Thank you. I don't play rugby, but I think I've got a connection with you guys. I did school cert Hort. And I also buy vegetables from the supermarket. That's probably my connection with horticulture. But anyway, school cert Hort was actually a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun because it was the easiest way to get an A+. It was because it was all the stuff from biology. So you could learn the stuff in biology and then do it again in horticulture. It was amazing. Anyway, that was a bad joke, wasn't it? What did you expect from an economist? So I'm also the chief economist at Simplicity. I just need to tell you that I can't give you financial advice. So if you need that, ask somebody else. But there's a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk to you about, and I've only got 30 minutes. And I want to talk about some big stuff, because I know you guys had somebody from MFAT here yesterday. Did you guys listen to her? Did she tell you anything? Not a lot? Or a lot and you didn't get it? It's okay. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the world, and I can tell you anything I want, and I can be as provocative as I want, which public servants can't. I'll talk a little bit about how history has returned, volatility is very much the norm, and that volatility is coming to New Zealand. A lot of that uncertainty we're seeing in terms of tariffs and uncertainty are just symptoms of underlying issues that I think we will also see in New Zealand. But when it comes to food, I'm extraordinarily bullish long term, right? The reality is that New Zealand is in that extraordinary position where we have heaps of land, we don't have any close borders with crazy people, and we have really good weather. And we have excellent officials at places like MFAT who've been building very strong connections with the rest of the world over a long period of time. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about that stuff. I want to talk a little bit about the context of horticulture. I want to talk a little bit about some of the levers that are in our control, which is really about the stuff we can do inside of our business, and really reflect on what I think might be happening in the space of people, because that's one of those places that I think is going to become much more challenging, but also an opportunity for change moving forward. Now, I'll start with politics, mainly because Andrew can't make it later today, so I can say whatever I want and he won't be able to defend himself. But no, I want to talk about politics in a much wider sense, in a more regime sense. So if you think about what most of us have experienced in terms of the political context, it's really been shaped by how we do politics in the course of the last 40 years, right? That's really been the norms of how we do things. But the reality is that while politics has told us that, look, if you just stick with us, this way of doing things is eventually make lots of people better off, that story is just not landing anymore. And that's exactly why we have Trump, that's why we have the rise of the far right in Europe, that's why we've got Brexit, that's why Farage is pretty much the strongest polling party in the UK right now. There are people rejecting the ways that we're doing things at the moment. And part of that, I think, is because the global order that was really kind of built after the Second World War was very much about, let's work together, we'll make more of the world richer, and we won't have to fight. That was pretty much the underlying thesis. And so the world got closer, we traded more, we lifted people out of poverty, and you can see that picture on the left-hand side. The share of the world living in poverty fell massively. But there is a hidden story there. While we have seen this reduction of inequality between countries, what we didn't see was the same improvement of inequality within countries. So if you look at the inequality of incomes and wealth in places like New Zealand, Australia, USA, UK, Europe, all of them saw a big increase in inequality in the 70s and 80s when we went through those big reforms. And the hope was that over time that would diminish, but it didn't. And what you can see on the right-hand side was initially we had that hope that things will get better. So we kind of stuck with it, right? But when it didn't get better, we started to get despondent. And that orange line on the right-hand side is the share of countries around the world that are politically polarized. And you can see that has been increasing for near on 30 years. What we're seeing in terms of Trump and Brexit and the rise of the far right are the expressions of that discontent now welling over, spilling over into reality. We should not expect that the political context, whether globally or in New Zealand, is going to go back to where it was in the past. What we're going to deal with is very rapid changes in governments and very rapid changes in policies for the foreseeable future. And we should assume the world will be more uncertain than ever before. When you're in this environment, there is a real temptation for governments and politicians of all stripes to promise unicorns. Anybody like unicorns? Yeah? Good. If you've got a girl, it's kind of like mandatory, right? My boys are not too into it, but that's just me. But the story of the unicorns is that picture on the right-hand side. You know, you can tell that I'm a bit of a nerd. I like Venn diagrams, right? Hands up, all those people who like Venn diagrams. Well, only a few. Yeah, not too bad. I wasn't expecting quite so many. When I do a conference of economists, all the hands go up. But when it comes to the story of unicorns, it's really asking, when you make promises, what are the choices? And we can really choose 2 out of those 3 things between good, cheap, and fast. You know this in your own projects, right? There are very few projects that are going to be good, cheap, and fast. But our politicians are increasingly being forced to say, look, I'm going to cut taxes, I'm going to cut spending, I'm going to cut the wait times at the hospital, I'm going to improve the quality of education, I'm going to improve the quality of infrastructure. Guess what? Those things are called unicorns. They can't deliver them. And when you can't deliver those unicorns, people have even more discontent, and we're much more willing to kick our governments out. And so my prediction, for what it's worth, and I should have started with a little bit of a caveat that my predictions quite often go wrong. I don't know if you guys know this, but I once called Wanganui a zombie town. And right after I called it a zombie town, the population of Wanganui started to grow. You're like, what happened? For 20 years, it had no growth. And then you call it zombie town once, and boom, it grows. Maybe it was me. But so we will get these things wrong. But I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of a sense of what's going on. The first thing is around what we're seeing with this discontent is the politics is now poisoned with a view that we don't really believe that working together to lift people up or having closer economic integration is necessarily the right thing or the right way of doing things. So the underlying thesis of what frames geopolitics has changed. When it comes to how we think about the economy and trade has changed. So, you know, there are not many things economists agree on, right? Have you guys heard this joke about one-handed economists? It's a little bit like that, right? There's always on the other hand. But when it comes to tariffs, there are almost no mainstream economists who will tell you that tariffs are good for the economy. And yet, what we are seeing around the world at the moment, particularly in the US, the biggest, richest, smartest country in the world, is imposing tariffs, which pretty much all economists assume and believe are bad for the economy. And so what we're seeing is this kind of essential rewriting of how we think about economic policy, trade policy. Same with climate change. So, you know, there's always going to be people who are skeptical when it comes to climate change policies, but what we're seeing now is those policies are actively being undone in global and local settings. So we are going to see changes in terms of adaptation policies, mitigation policies. These things are going to go back and forth a lot. And this matters because for all of us, we are reliant on stability of the political environment for us to do our jobs, right? We want to have policies and regulations that are progressively and consistently getting better. It doesn't always happen, but that's what we're looking for. But if the government's changing all the time, it's very hard for us to do that. We know that it's happening at the same time as a lot of fiscal pressures for a lot of governments, not just because of the splurge of spending during COVID, but also because we all have aging populations. All these things are happening at the same time. What we're likely to see is lots of knee-jerk changes in public policies and rules and regulations and very rapid changes in governments. My prediction is that we are not going to see another 3-term government in our lifetimes. It's going to be at most 2, more likely 1-term governments, because our politicians will keep offering unicorns, they will not be able to deliver them, and then we'll kick them out. And then we'll realize that we hate the next lot even more than the previous lot. And that's exactly what's happening right now. So if you look at the way that we think about politics and think about whether the country's heading in the right direction, it was really high during the first year of the first term of the last Labour government. And we were all very happy. You know, like, we didn't die from COVID. Great. The second term of Labour government was like, oh, you're still doing the same old things. We don't like you anymore. And favourability went really bad and went from net positive to really negative. And then we said, look, we're going to kick you guys out and we're going to get somebody else. And we did. And then we're like, oh, it still sucks because we've got a recession and don't like you either. And so it's kind of like, it's not necessarily the politicians we don't like, we just don't like the settings that we find ourselves in. So what we're going to see is quite a lot of attack on institutions. So what happens when you've got this uncertainty is you've got politicians who are really desperate to do things as quickly as possible, and they'll break things along the way. So what you're going to find is if you believe that you're only going to be in power for one term, you want to make sure you get all those things you want to change done as quickly as possible. It doesn't have to be good, you just want to get it done. And do as much change as possible so the next lot is too exhausted to unwind it all, right? It's not going to stick because it's good, it's just going to stick because you just don't have time to unwind everything. And that's a really big problem, right? Because as businesses and individuals, we do rely on that wider setting of good rules and regulations for us to get on with doing things. And there is a real fear in my mind that what we're going to see is not only are those rules and regulations changes really quickly, the state capacity to provide good policy advice is diminishing. And there's a real risk in that because we want good policy advice, we want to make sure those options and choices are in front of us. But what we're seeing is this, because of this rush, because of this urgency to get things done, good policy making is being sidelined. And it's not just this government, it's been happening for a while, and I think it's going to escalate. This is one of the biggest risks that faces us over the course of the next few decades, because I think it's going to create a very unpredictable backdrop for all of us. Now, I'm a very depressing kind of guy. I just wanted to kind of tell you that there are some reasons why we should be a little bit optimistic. And part of that is the reason why we're so good in food and fiber, the reason why we're so good at making food is because we're a freaking huge country. I didn't actually ask permission if I was allowed to swear before I started. I'm all good? All right. I was at this conference the other week, and they were all kind of like hard-out Christians. And I was dropping all these F-bombs in the room, and I was like, only realized afterwards, and I was like, whoa, that was not a good plan. But anyway, the picture on the picture behind me, you can see New Zealand overlaid on top of UK and overlaid on top of Europe, and what you can see is we're a huge country. Yes, we've got some mountain ranges right through the middle of the South Island, but even with that, what we've got is this extraordinary amount of land in New Zealand. And for, pretty much since colonization, we've been using it for farming, so it's not surprising that we have this extraordinary competitive advantage when it comes to our land mass and our weather. The other thing that really helps us, of course, is that we don't have many close neighbors that are really horrible, right? And we don't have a lot of history with. So if you look at what happens when around New Zealand, you draw a 2,000-kilometer radius around Wellington, not many people around it. You draw a 2,000-kilometer radius around Berlin, and you've got all the history of the last several thousand years, and Putin, right? So there is a huge amount of uncertainty, both domestically in terms of all the historical border-related conflict, but also that kind of this escalating return of the Cold War stuff that's going on. So there's some really big challenges that are facing other countries around the world, and New Zealand, being relatively small, relatively far away, relatively neutral, is actually in a relatively good position. So I feel really optimistic that a lot of the geopolitical stuff, we're not exactly immune, but we're certainly a lot removed, and we don't expect the same kind of issues that other people are experiencing. But also, that, with that waterway, sometimes Navy ships do come in here. And you might recall there was a Chinese Navy ship that did some exercises recently, so we're not exactly immune. The other reason why I'm really optimistic is because our economy has become more diversified over time. You might have seen people saying, oh, we really, really need to get more diversified. Yes, of course, we could do much more. But if you look at those two pictures behind me, on the left-hand side shows you the mix of our exports by commodity, and on the right-hand side is the mix of our exports by country. And yes, there are lots of countries and lots of commodities that we are really, really specialized in. But those big orange bars just show you that there is this big group of other that we're exporting more with, we are trading more of, and that gives me real confidence that New Zealand is much more diversified than it has ever been in our history, and that's a good thing. Should we do more? Absolutely. Can we do more? Of course, but we're already doing a lot, and we should celebrate the wins that we have made. There's one other reason for optimism, and that's really around the rising wealth around the global economy. And it's really about the rise of the global south, those developing markets around the world which are increasing in their incomes, their middle classes are growing, and that's having a really big positive effect for a lot of our industry, more for, I guess, meat, dairy, those kinds of things than our industry, but we certainly get some of those benefits. So I just want to show you what happened in places like Korea as a nice little example. So on the left-hand side is Korea's GDP per capita, and you can see that it went from being a fairly poor country to being relatively rich in a very short period of time. And in that period of very strong growth of incomes, what we saw was that as you got richer, our diet changes a massive amount, right? So we're eating a lot more meat, we're eating a lot more roots and tubers and vegetables. Not so much, but you can see where we are is towards the bottom of it, whereas the other industries that are benefiting a lot more are around proteins. So we tend to increase our proteins a huge amount. So it has a positive influence on our industry, but very much in the premium end of products rather than on the mainstream end of products. There's also a question in my mind, particularly when it comes to social licenses around who are we feeding? So quite often when we talk about our agricultural sector, primary sector, we talk a lot about our exports, but we don't produce goods only for export, we also produce goods to feed New Zealanders. And these numbers have been quite shocking to me over the course of recent years, because what I hadn't appreciated was just how much poverty has grown in New Zealand. We've always had inequality, that's kind of normal, and maybe not acceptable, but normal. But the poverty growth has been quite striking. Just to give you a sense in terms of your sector, you can see on those columns on the left-hand side, what that shows you is the share of households that are buying fruit and vegetables in any given week. So going back to the 80s until recently, between 80 and 90% of households would buy fruit and vegetables every week, right? That's pretty normal. In 2023, it was 60%. 40% of New Zealand households were not buying fruit and vegetables every single week. It doesn't mean they're never buying it, it just means they're not buying it as frequently. And in fact, that's the same story that I heard from many of my supermarket customers. They're seeing that in the behavior of that. But there's a real issue here, right? That connection that we have to our country and to our community through the produce that we make. If they're not able to afford it, it creates a lot of heartache. And you might have seen butter in the headlines a lot recently. And the reason why every time I post about butter on LinkedIn, people love it. And I'm like, how much butter do you guys eat? They probably bake a lot. Now, butter is delicious, but the reality is that it's not just butter, right? And as you can see in the picture on the behind me, it's a lot of things that people are doing without. It's that expansion of poverty that's taking place. And therein lies, I think, one of the issues in terms of social license. But I think the myth of social license is that nobody loves farming, everybody hates us, the urbanized don't like us, right? There's a lot of that kind of narrative. It's absolute mischief, and it is not true. In fact, the data shows very clearly that New Zealanders have a lot of positive views, very positive views, when it comes to farming. So close to 3/4 of New Zealanders say that they hold a positive view of the farming sector. So when people say that, oh, we don't like farmers, it's not that, we just don't think about you, right? Most urban people in our interaction with farming is very removed, it's very artificial. You do it through the supermarket, through the shop, but you're not actually connected to how things are made. And if you look on the right-hand side, your sector is actually at the top end of the farming community. So let's not beat ourselves up about how nobody loves us. They love you. Just acknowledge that the people love you and move on, right? I don't want to hear any talk about backbones. This is a thing that I have with a lot of people. It's like, farming is the backbone of the economy. And I'm like, what about all the other bones for a functional animal, right? So when it comes to horticulture, I think there is a couple of different ways I approach it. And one is to think about who we sell our products to and where our revenue goes out to. Now, these are not perfect numbers because there's always bits that you might include and things you might exclude. But what you can see on the left-hand side is that we are a hugely exporting sector, right? So majority of our products that we sell goes towards the export market. That's in the kind of top big butt. And then there is a bit we sell to consumers as kind of vegetables and fruit. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff we sell into industry to be processed into other things. Completely understandable. But when we get that revenue, what happens? That revenue is spent on supplies. Everything from the labor hire companies to banks and lawyers to all of those suppliers that look after us to do our business well. We pay wages in terms of all the jobs that we create, and of course, we make profits. And you should be proud of the profits that you make. This is one of the big things that I like to tell New Zealand businesses. Be proud of making profits. If you're not making profits, you don't have a good business. I want you to have a great business. I want you to be profitable. And I want you to have great jobs and great wages. That's how we create good outcomes. There is nothing wrong with margins. There is nothing wrong with profits. We need to celebrate success of business a lot more. And on the right-hand side just gives a little bit of context over time in terms of where those different parts of our sales go. That big line at the top, that's exports of fruit and vegetables. And you can see that's really skyrocketed in the last couple of years. A lot of that has been to do with pricing. We've seen some fabulous pricing, particularly when it comes to things like kiwi fruit, but our fruit and veg exports are really skyrocketing at the moment. At the bottom, you can see what's going on in terms of spend by consumers in that light shaded green area. And the dark green area is the imports of fruit and vegetables that we get from other parts of the world. So we still, of course, we're not going to produce everything in New Zealand, so there's nothing wrong with imports, but I think we might think about where there's a little bit of substitution taking place, whether or not we want to improve that in time. One of the pressures that is coming through is really around land use. A lot of horticulture land is close to urban areas, and that's a real pressure. I don't know if any of you are from Pukekohe. Every time I go there, I look at the land with some envy, and then I see all those houses that we're building on top of it, and you go, this is fucking crazy, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to get this kind of land back, and it's really extraordinary that we're doing that. But if you look at the picture on the left-hand side, that's the kind of the total amount of land under production for horticulture. The numbers, the survey quality is a bit iffy, so it's more on the trends, and you can see that overall the trend has been upwards. And over the course of the last 20 years, most of the reason why we have produced more products is not because we're using more land. Most of it has been because we're getting better utilization of the land that we have. You can also see on the picture on the right-hand side that what we're using that land for is changing a lot. There is a huge amount of shift in terms of the types of areas where there is a lot of planting going on. It's really around the expansion of the wine sector, that grape wine planting that's been increasing. There has been a huge amount of growth in other parts of horticulture. And that is a little bit troubling to me because there's nothing wrong with wine. I love drinking wine myself. But the reality is that when you think about the shortage of, well, not the shortage, the number of New Zealanders who are unable to feed themselves fresh food, are we actually meeting the needs of our community and all the opportunities that are there? And the reason why I think there are opportunities when it comes to horticulture is really because it's a hugely efficient use of that land. So there are two pictures here. The picture on the left-hand side is the productivity of the horticulture sector. This is productivity as economists define it, right? You guys might think about productivity more as an efficiency measure in terms of, am I getting better throughput from my work, am I in terms of processing, those kinds of things. But the thing that I'm looking at is, for every worker that have you got, are you making more profits and are you getting better wages? That's really what counts for me as an economist. And that's what we measure when we talk about productivity at a macro level. So what you can see on the left-hand side is the picture of productivity in the horticulture sector. The bit at the bottom is compensation of employees. That's the wages and salaries that we pay our people. And that dark or green bar is the profits that we make as businesses. And what you can see is that there has actually been a real kind of impact on profits in the last couple of years. This data is up to 2024. And that's a little bit of a concern for me because until recently, until about 2 years ago, we had been seeing really encouraging and strong growth in productivity in the sector. We were getting more profitable, we're getting better jobs, better wages, but that hasn't been the case in the last couple of years. I think that should be a real wake-up call for us, that after the wins that we had banked for nearly a decade, something's happened in the last couple of years, quite possibly to do that rapidly rising cost of doing business, all those input costs going up, but it just makes us even more important that we figure out how we get better efficiency gains. But when I looked at the picture, did the numbers on the right-hand side, I had to go back and check my numbers, like, is that right? What that shows you is the productivity of the agriculture sector per hectare, and the very big bar on the right-hand side is the productivity per hectare of the horticulture sector. Our sector is 22 times more productive than the rest of agriculture because we're not massive in terms of footprint, but what we can do in that footprint is extraordinary. And I think we need to be really mindful of understanding why it's important for us to protect the footprint that we do have, because that footprint is hugely valuable in terms of the economic returns that we create. Now, while the sector has been growing, as you saw before, our productivity has been increasing, our exports have been increasing, our production domestically has been increasing, the number of people we employ hasn't been increasing very much. In fact, it's been on a slight gradual downward trend. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it tells us is that we've been getting much more efficient in the way that we use our workers, and that's fine. And on the right-hand side is just a picture in terms of what's going on in terms of the different segments of the horticulture sector. Now, I was reminded earlier on today that a lot of this won't count seasonal labor and the labor hire that's quite often included in the data. So there's some issues and gaps in the data, but I think you guys will be able to see what's going on in your own sector in this data set. But the issue for me is more around, even though we're not growing the number of people in our sector, we are very busy hiring people all the time. We spend a huge amount of time, effort, and resources hiring people. So that's the picture on the left-hand side. That light green bars are the number of people that we've hired in the last 12 months because they left. And the little green bar on top is because the industry is growing or shrinking. The reason why we hire people is not because our industry is growing or shrinking. The reason we hire people in our industry is because of turnover, churn. And churn has benefits, but also costs. Benefits in that it gives you flexibility, but the cost is in terms of not just the recruitment, but the training, the integration, the health and safety, all those things that go with it, but also the long-term gains that you get in terms of productivity. So roughly speaking, within a year of hiring somebody, 70% plus people in the horticulture industry have left. So you've spent all the time hiring people, getting them up to speed into your business, doing the work, and then they're going to leave, and they might come back, but we don't know for sure. One of the reasons why that happens is because of seasonality, which is, of course, a lot of your work is seasonal, I get that. And in the panel afterwards, we'll talk about how we might be able to reduce some of the seasonality in our workplaces by work design, business design, and those kinds of things. But those two pictures behind me kind of tell you that picture of seasonality. You can see there kind of the highs and lows in terms of our seasons. Again, nothing surprising, but you can see that, particularly in the fruit industry, huge amounts of variation because of picking and thinning that goes on. I did some picking and thinning of apples when I was at high school. It was really good money, actually, when you're only trying to save up for beers on Fridays. It's pretty good. But it's not just the seasonality. I think there is something else that's going on. The seasonality doesn't explain all of the 70% of new hires that are gone within 12 months. When we are hiring people, quite often these are people that are coming from different industries, right? People have gone and worked in a different industry, and then they're coming to ours. There's nothing wrong with that. This happens in every industry. So I think a lot of people in New Zealand don't understand that something like 1 million people started a new job in the last 12 months in New Zealand. 1 million people, right? So turnover is like a feature of New Zealand, and I think it's a terrible feature because the more higher turnover you have, the higher the potential costs are for your business. But it's not just that you're hiring people. When you're hiring people that are coming from different industries, people who are coming straight out of school or university, quite often they're coming with no skills, none of their background knowledge, and that makes it much harder. There's also a myth that it's all about immigration. Most of the workers we're hiring is kind of all tied to the immigration story. Of course, there is a huge amount of immigration that happens, and the RSC workforce is very important for your industry in particular. But if you look at where the source of our workers are, by and large, it's New Zealand citizens and residents, right? And yes, we use people on work visas and temporary visas, but by and large, most of the people we're going to employ are already here. And it's really important we think very carefully about how that works. And the reason I say that is because I think immigration is going to become a very political beast in New Zealand over the coming years. So to give you the statistic, the total number of people who arrived into New Zealand as permanent and long-term migrants in the last 10 years was 1.4 million people. We lost a lot of people because they buggered off, because if you have work visas and whatnot, you can't stay, and then we export a lot of New Zealanders to the West Island, right? But the reality is that churn creates a huge amount of resentment within the community. So in Australia, over 90% of people say immigrants make good citizens, and in New Zealand, it's only 50%. And the reason for that is we have such reliance on immigration to prop up economic growth, to prop up our labor market, to prop up our skill shortages. Everything is seen as a short-term solution through immigration. And if immigration becomes less available in the future or it becomes stop-start, it might be an existential threat to some of our industries and some of our businesses. And it's going to happen at the same time as an aging population. I show that picture on the left-hand side because every time I plot that chart, it scares the hell out of me. That's the share of New Zealanders that are aged between 15 to 64, right? And what you can see there is we went through this extraordinary period of demographic dividend when we had lots of young people essentially entering the workforce. So even though we're always getting older, right, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with old people. It's just that we don't have those people working in our industry. And so as our population ages and we have fewer of those working age people around, that competition for those young people are going to intensify. Are they going to come work for you or somebody else? How can you make your job more permanent, higher paid, better quality, and all those things? Because if you don't, in that environment, we are really going to struggle. And what you can see on the picture on the right-hand side is we tend to over-index in terms of people who are young, and we tend to under-index people who are middle-aged. So we tend to be very competitive. We're competing really hard for young people when it comes to workers. And what I'm telling you is we're running out of young people. you better have a really good strategy in terms of how you're going to recruit people across different age groups, different spaces in life, and make the most of what you can. Now, when it comes to skill gaps, because I think that's really what we're talking about, is the reason we're hiring a lot of people is we do need these workers. It's not like our businesses can operate without these workers, right? Any business is a collection of people who happen to be in a particular industry. You guys are very specialized in horticulture, but any business is just a collection of people who come together to do something together that creates an outcome. Now, when it comes to skill shortages, quite often we think about those hard and technical skills, right? And that's very understandable because it's the easy one to look at. Do you know how to do X, Y, Z? But the reality is that quite often what makes a person, after the initial period, really good at their job is if they have those right skills, those right attributes, their ways of thinking, getting on with other people, their ability to get on with the team, all those bits and pieces. And as a result, I think quite often we're recruiting for technical skills when we really should be thinking about people with the right attributes. And when we think about training, quite often our industry is not doing enough in terms of formal training, but also we're not doing enough in terms of the bits that work really well, which is on-the-job training. Vocational training is the most effective way of training people. If you want productivity and good outcomes in your business, the most effective way of training people is through on-the-job training, in-house training, mentoring, and vocational education. So those things are pretty obvious. The other thing that's pretty obvious, I think, to many of us is that for businesses to take advantage of the best technology and best kit that's out there, it requires good management skills. So slightly difficult picture there, but essentially on the left-hand side, what it shows is if you've got higher management score, higher management quality, you're more likely to get the latest kit, make more investments. On the right-hand side, what you can see is that once you make that investment, the payoff of that investment might take 3 to 4 years. So there is a lot of patience that is required. Whether it's in skills or a new kit, quite often what it requires are good leaders who are able to take a long-term investment and a long-term decision to do the right thing in terms of getting the right kit, getting the right people, invest in the right training with the confidence that they'll get the return in some years' time. Now, I'm out of time, but I want to just kind of touch very briefly on this idea of productivity and people, because one of the big issues, I think, is we think about productivity in a very mechanical and technical sense rather than that wider sense. And what I want you to think about when you think about productivity is I want you as a business owner to make more money, and I want your workers to have better jobs either through job quality and or through better pay. And that's what productivity looks like to me. To make that happen, I think there are 3 questions we need to ask ourselves. Do I know what's available out in the community, either in terms of the best technology or the best skills, best training that's available? And 2, do I know which of those things will be right in my business? Do I have it? And the final question is probably the hardest one, which is holding the mirror up and asking, can I use those things in my business? Do I have good leaders? Do I have good managers? And do I have a good culture in my organization? Because those are the absolute critical things that create that good outcome. Now, here are some big takeaways for me. The backdrop is uncertain. I think uncertainty is going to amplify. I think politics is going to play havoc with our plans. What we need to do is, if we can't control these things, we should control the things that we can do in our own businesses. And I think it starts with us. We should invest in our leadership, we should invest in our management, invest in our culture, because those are the things that we can do that will play big dividends, because it will allow us to take the right investments. And those investments are both the informal and formal training, but also about thinking about how we can, when we recruit all those people every year, that we're not just recruiting people on technical skills, but also on some of those attributes so that they can become much bigger parts of our businesses in the future. The very final thing is really around kind of a little bit of a plea in terms of the education and vocational education sector. I'm very disappointed by the reforms that we're seeing at the moment, because all we see is reforms in vocational education, but we don't see progress. I don't want us to keep breaking things. I want us to also make sure that industry is present in the room to be able to say, these are the things that are working, let's keep doing that. These are not things not working, let's improve those. But the final thing that I'll leave you with is, all of this stuff is probably not going to come as a surprise to you. But if you want a real say in vocational education or industry policy, you got to have a seat at the table. The only seat at the table that comes with a counting vote is one that pays levies. If you don't pay levies, you're not going to have the control over what happens in terms of education and strategy for your industry. That might be a really difficult one for a lot of people to swallow, but I want you to think about it, is how can we create more long-term nature of vocational training that's fit for our industry and industry strategy that's fit for our industry, where we get to have a real say, where we get to have influence, and we're not held hostage by who happens to be in the beehive at a given point in time. That is my biggest fear, because outside of that, I'm extraordinarily optimistic for the sector, because you guys are extraordinarily efficient, extraordinarily productive, and you are one of the few good news stories out in the economy right now. Thank you.